in this second video, I'd like to look at how Norman castle building changed from 1066 to 1087. Now, you'll remember in the last video, I talked about how the fact that castles appear throughout all of the other 4 units that we have been looking at so far. And castles are one of those key features that happen throughout the Norman reign. But what I really want to look at in this video is these 2 periods of time here, 1066 to 71 and 1071 to 1087, and how castle building changes in those years after 1066. And I'm going to do that by looking at this in 2 halves. First of all, I'm going to look at that first period when there were lots of rebellions, and then I'm going to look at that second period when they were consolidating power. Firstly, let's look at this initial period. And I've started in 1068 because we looked at those first few castles in the last video. So this is 2 years after the Normans have invaded, up to the end of 1071, when the last of those rebellions were phasing out. And we're going to look at 3 questions in each of those periods: why they built castles, what they were like, and how many were built. Now, in this first period, castles were pretty much built in the wake of rebellions. So in Exeter, a castle was built after Githa had her rebellion because it allowed the Normans to stamp their control on the town. William also built 2 Motte and Bailey castles in York in 1068 and 1069, which I'm sure you know is the era of when the Harrying of the North happened. Other Norman castles were built during this period by people like William Fitz-Osborne along dangerous borders like the one with Wales. So castles in this period were built to stop rebellion. They were built to show as a kind of status symbol of the Norman force and the Norman control of the land. Now, those castles were commonly had mottes that were about 5 meters high. They commonly had a dominating tower, and the bailey would have been fairly small. Then, most of all, those entire fortresses were surrounded by a moat. Key thing of these early castles was that motte and the tower, and the motte and the tower was the thing that was imposing on those towns and on those regions where they were trying to stop resistance. And by 1071, the Normans had built about 35 castles in England to defeat English resistance. So that is the first period of castle building. An example of that is here, my favourite castle, the castle at Chepstow, just over the other side of the River Severn from where I am in Bristol. And this castle, Chepstow, is a classic example of one of those castles built along the Welsh border to stop rebellion from the Welsh. Now, let's flip now to looking at the second half of William's reign. In this second half, this is where William is consolidating power. And I'd like to look at, again, the same 3 questions in this second half of his reign up until his death in the 1080s. So why did they build castles in this period? Well, actually, the reason was very different from that first half. In this second half of William's reign, the castles were built to settle the land. They stopped the rebellion, they stopped the resistance. Now they need to control and consolidate their power. And so this is why castles were built. So most of the castles in this period were built by Norman barons on their new lands in the countryside as status symbols. They're less to do with defence, they're less to do with the military, they're much more about settling the land and the Normans building really somewhere to live and so they can control the land. What were the castles like though? Well, they tended to be standard Motte and Bailey castles. They were often made of wood. They often had wooden palisades and gatehouses, but the layout did vary from castle to castle, and you can see that across England today. Those castles are really different. The big difference here in this second period is how many castles are being built though. In that first period, you'll remember, they were in the 30s. In this period, over 500 castles were built. So this is kind of like a boom in terms of the time of castle building. Castles are suddenly built in their hundreds in this period. The Normans have dealt with that resistance. Now they're moving on to the second task of consolidating the land, and one of the ways they do that is building absolutely boatloads of castles across England. And a really nice example of that is Rochester Castle, which was built by one of William's barons. And here it is today. It wouldn't have looked like this in the Norman time, right at the start of William's reign, because it would have been wood, but over time they would have turned it into this stone structure here. So if we're going to end on the question that this video started with, how did Norman castle building change? Well, it changed in three ways. It changed because of the purpose. Originally, those castles were built to stop resistance, but over time they change into a purpose of settling the land. They change in terms of their structure. Originally, the first castles were much more just about building imposing moats on towns of resistance. Eventually, they turn into places where barons can use to control the land, and as a result, are motte and bailey style castles. And the castle building also changes for the third reason in terms of its sheer volume. In the initial period, there are only a handful of castles that are built. In that second half of William's reign, absolutely shed load of castles are built.